Yes.
Were there any, out of this appreciation for jazz in Spain, did any Spanish musicians embrace jazz that these poets also wrote about?
Absolutely. There was a very vibrant jazz scene in Madrid particularly, and in Barcelona. Barcelona has always been very attuned to the rest of Europe, and especially France. And France was one of the biggest centers of jazz, especially Paris, has always been. And so yes, there were several musicians from Spain. Tete Montoliu, for example, who was blind and was a great pianist. Vladi Vaz, for example, Pedro Iturralde, and these were musicians that had a direct connection with American musicians that were touring in Europe. They very often would go to Paris, would go to London, would go to Scandinavia. Let's face it, you know, in Europe, a lot of these African American jazz musicians were treated better than in their own country, and many of them actually moved over there and married over there and began families over there. So yes, there's a very vibrant community of jazz musicians in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even today. Jazz is not a popular kind of music in Spain, like I don't think it is in the United States either, but there are a lot of musicians that still play it, and it's still very much alive over there. Absolutely, yes. The answer would be yes.
I want to follow up on that question, that racism in Spain, I mean, you find that the jazz musicians in general in the United States, because exactly as you said, they're African Americans. It's a reaction almost to the pain and suffering they have because of slavery. You don't really see that much in Spain, in my unbiased opinion, because you don't really have, you have the, as you said, the African Americans that go to Europe because it's better conditions in Europe. Do you see a lot of, I know you said African, sure, but you don't really see the overt racism you do in the United States.
No, not to the extent.
Microaggressions more than anything else.
Maybe not to the extent, but like Lorca, you know, mixes or links the plight of the African American people in the U.S. with the Gypsies or los Gitanos in Spain, and I think, you know, that there is a connection there very clearly. Not only because there is also a kind of jazz called Gypsy jazz, you know, Django Reinhardt and all those guys in France and in Belgium, and you know, but you know, obviously. Unfortunately, you know, Spain does have its, especially, you know, at the time of Franco, the racism was there, not against Africans because there weren't many,
right,
but mostly against the gypsies that, you know, had lots of problems. Exactly. So yes, but the reality is that, you know, musicians like Man Webster, you know, a lot of the African American musicians that, you know, were sort of popular in America in the 40s and 50s, in the 60s they start gravitating towards Europe because they're just paid better, they're kind of revered as great musicians, and they're just treated better from a social perspective. So yeah, but I mean, Spain did have and still does have its you know, problems with racism, and I think with more and more immigration these days into Spain as a gateway to the rest of Europe, it has become a bigger problem than it was maybe when I was a kid, because, you know, the diversity was not as obvious then as it is now.
Is there a, I want to use the right word, is there a traditional, I mean, not knowing much about music history in Spain, is there a traditional sort of Spanish mode of folk music, let's say, that found a way to interface with jazz, or are those sort of writing parallel tracks?
No, absolutely. That's very interesting, because obviously, you know, flamenco music being very popular in Spain, having to do with all of the different trends of Spanish folk music, especially in the south, and related to gypsy music, related to Arabic music as well. In the 60s, it's very interesting how, you know, the jazz musicians start to intersect with the flamenco musicians, and so there's this it's also the time of fusion, the late 60s, the early 70s, you know, jazz rock, jazz funk, you know, those kinds of things. Well, in Spain, there's this jazz flamenco trend in which, you know, you see saxophonists like Pedro Iturralde playing the sax, and you know, then flamenco guitarists playing their instrument, and it's kind of like a very interesting mixture of jazz and flamenco. They usually talk about flamenco music as the blues of Spain, you know, just like fado is the blues of Portugal. And so I think it works really well, you know, the mixture of jazz and I, you know, in the book I do talk a little bit about that, and of course the few histories of jazz in Spain that have been written, there aren't too many, but the ones that have been written do put a big emphasis on that, because it's kind of more like a homegrown
Right.
sort of jazz. So yeah, absolutely. Yep.
You see that influence working the same kind of question, but working the other way, like as there began to be a proliferation of jazz musicians, or in Spanish jazz musicians, they began to influence American jazz artists. I don't think you mentioned Miles Davis, but I know he has an album called Sketches of
Sketches of Spain. Yeah.
I don't know if that was influenced by Spanish jazz or just his impressions of the country in general. But
That was, he traveled through Europe. He was in Spain some of the time, and he came in contact with flamenco music.
yeah.
And that's how he came up with the idea of recording a whole album. In fact, that album, Sketches of Spain, is really good, and it's almost like a forerunner of the Spanish flamenco jazz that would come later, because this was done earlier than any of the Spanish flamenco jazz. So Miles Davis, in many ways, was ahead of his time. I mean, we know that he was ahead of his time in many ways, but also in this case, it's a great album. I love the cover, and I just love the music inside it. And yeah, I do mention that album in the, because I feel like a lot of Spanish jazz fans, and you know, there were quite a few, and there still are. They were very happy to see that somebody like Miles Davis was interested in Spain and in Spanish music, and they took it almost as, you know, just like a tip of the hat of Miles to the Spanish tradition of music. So yeah, I really love that album. It's very good. Yeah.
Anton, I think that these poets were lucky in some way to have such great musicians to be inspired by, you know, from Billie Holiday to Miles Davis. But then the 90s, we get stuck with Kenny G and smooth jazz. So I just wondered, did anybody sort of make a joke poem referring to Kenny G and that sort of sterile? I hate that smooth jazz.
You know, I hadn't thought about that, but that would be a funny poem, really, if they had done it. I have never seen anything like that. I think, you know, a lot of, I would say maybe a lot of these poets were sort of like very serious in their in their interest in jazz, and so they really wanted to dig deeper than, you know, whatever trends were coming along, and so they were more interested in the older type of jazz. I feel like a lot of these poets are fans of jazz up until, you know, the free jazz period of the 60s and 70s, Ornette Coleman, Sun Ra, and all those guys. Yeah. And after that, I think they kind of lose interest because there are all of these icons that they can refer back to. Yeah. But I remember, you know, growing up in Spain and listening to jazz radio shows. You know, they never played Kenny G because they thought that was just not jazz. I mean, it was just too lightweight for that kind of thing. So, yeah, but you know, one thing that's interesting is that you know, the Franco government lasted from 1939 to 1975, and you think, you know, this is a fascist dictatorship. You know, not a lot of freedom of the press or any kind of freedom in any way. And however, you know, they did have so many visiting jazz musicians, both black and white. And sometimes, you know, when you start reading about that and you start digging into that history of the visiting musicians from America, it is very surprising to me to think, for example, that Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald, you know, played at the Teatro Real in Madrid in the 1960s. You know, that to me sounds almost like out of this world, but bearing in mind the kind of country Spain was. But of course, we're talking about Madrid, you know, the capital city, one of the big cities in Europe, also Barcelona, that was always very active culturally. So you start understanding a little better. If you lived in Vigo in the 1960s or in the 50s, you know, when I was born, you wouldn't have any access to any of that jazz stuff, or at least a very little. So yeah, no, I have not seen a poem about Kenny G, but I wish there were one.
Probably wouldn't want to read it if there was.
Did you ever have any of the same like political commentary maybe by some of the vocal jazz musicians? Maybe bit more nuanced.
By the vocal
Yeah.
jazz musicians? Well, some of these poets, some of them did understand English, some of them did not, but, a lot of the musicians that they reference are not vocal jazz musicians, except for, of course, Billie Holiday, who gets referenced a lot, and Louis Armstrong, who, also sang. So a lot of the poems are actually based on the lyrics of songs, titles of songs, or lyrics of songs, because a lot of these poets, I think they thought that some of the best poetry that was written in the United States throughout the 20th century had to do with song lyrics. There were very good poets, and there are still very good poets in the United States, but I think that we should not overlook the fact that there's a lot of poetry that is related to music that America produced in the 20th century, and that sometimes is a little bit overlooked because of the fact that it was written to be sung more than written to be read. But the musicians were inspired by both the sounds of the music, but also by the lyrics of some of the songs, like "Strange Fruit" or "Don't Explain" by Billie Holiday, or there are other examples. For example, in this anthology, there's several examples of that. So yeah.
Since it's March with St. Patrick's Day coming up, I wrote a limerick about Kenny G. There once was a man named G who played his horn like a buzzed bee. He can be heard on a lift, if you catch my drift. He doesn't mean much to me.
Well, maybe
So
there's a,
you can translate that to Spanish.
if there's a second edition of the book, maybe we could put that in here. So, yeah. But in any case, what I really wanted to do was, just present an evolution, but also kind of make this presentation a little bit as an invitation for everyone to get closer to get closer to the records, to have an access to this music, and also to know that the bad thing is anthologies like these are not translated into English. But those of you that may read Spanish at least a little bit, this book I ordered for the library years ago, and right now it's not there, but it will be available because I have my own copy of it, but it'll be available there. So if anybody wants to check it out, this is a very good introduction, kind of like a gateway to the jazz poetry written in Spain over more than 100 years, really. So yeah, that was the intention, and that's the intention of the book as well. So I appreciate your interest in it.